actually to come to Wolverhampton, University of Wolverhampton, whether in Telford or here, or indeed to Wolverhampton. So it was always a bit of a challenge to navigate the one-way system and things like that. But we're here, we're started, thanks to your good selves. I was asked about 3 months ago to suggest a topic for this session, and it's always a little bit of a gamble, thinking, well, what's going to be topical. A lot of my work over the last 2 years or so has been looking at and trying to understand the relationship between the rapidly changing economy. What does that mean for enterprise, higher education, small business, growing businesses, and so on? And as we go forward, it just seems to get more and more complex. So we've got a topic here. I wondered earlier this week, actually, I'd rather have picked something a little bit simpler than that. It is quite complex, but it's certainly topical. My academic get-out is I'm not pretending to have all of the answers, but at least if we can focus on some questions, then that may be useful. The reasons for the Pooh Bear, some of you will recognise Tigger there. Tigger is kind of the hyperactive entrepreneur who's always rushing about trying to innovate and do new things, and some of the other A.A. Milne cartoon characters, their roles will become evident as well. So what we're going to try and do is really just to make sense of the changing economy in the post-recession era, if it is a post-recession era. That's one of the questions I'm going to ask. I'm not an economist, I'll say that. Do we have any economists in the room? No, that's okay, right. So, one, it's okay. We probably, including myself, we probably all know a bit more about economics than we did a couple of years ago. So making sense of what's going on. I think trying to make sense of what's the role of entrepreneurship and education and learning in this new economy that we've got. How does it need to change? And what are the implications of what I'm going to call a new era, which I think we really are in? What's the implications of this new era for entrepreneurs, people starting, running and growing businesses? And I think we have some practitioners in the room, for educators and researchers, and indeed for universities, and more generally, I guess, for society and the economy. So that's the background. Here we have Pooh. Does anyone remember Pooh Bear? Anyone? Yeah? Yes. Anyone remember the good old E.H. Shepherd illustrations? Here we have Christopher Robin pulling his teddy bear down the stairs, and Pooh Bear, if he could think at all, is thinking, bump, bump, bump. If only, there must be a better way of coming downstairs. If only the bumping would stop for a minute, we might be able to think of what it is. And that to me is a bit like the last couple of years. The bumping has just kept on. There must be a better way of doing things. We certainly haven't found it yet. So it's quite a serious topic, and I do think we're here at an important time. We're at an important time in terms of, I guess, the West Midlands economy. I live in the East Midlands. We've heard this week about abolition of the regional development agencies, for example, just one of many, many changes that seem to be out there. There seems to be another banking crisis brewing up in mainland Europe just at the moment, very important, and major issues going off in the European economies, the UK economies, and the worldwide economy. There's a lot going on. So very serious topics that we're actually talking about, but I thought we'll lighten them just a little bit by, you'll see the icons of Pooh and Piglet, Eeyore and Wool, and they may be kind of representative of entrepreneurial identities at a more subliminal level, or indeed they may not. We shall see. I'm going to start with some questions. Some of you, I don't know if anyone ever did any kind of engineering training where you started with a pre-test, then you had some training, then you had a post-test at the end. I don't recall that. Or maybe it's too long ago. We're going to start with some questions, and we'll see how we get on, and then I've got my presentation to do, and then we'll go back to the questions at the end. So, what do we think? Is the recession over? In your experience, do you think the recession is over?
No.
Oh, far from it. It's still there. So we're not yet in this post-recession era. Just because we've had two quarters of flatlining doesn't mean the recession's over. And we're just doing a quick survey at the moment around business confidence and economic impact, and that's exactly the message we're getting. It's not over by any means. We'll look at, this is not political, as an academic I try and stay non-political, but I think we have to look at what's going on in the economy, likely effects of budget policies on new enterprises, small firms, universities and educators. Just any thoughts on that? Any thoughts on the impact of the budget?
Deflationary.
Deflationary, yeah. Taking a lot of money out of the economy. So something like around about 130 billion or so over the next 5 years. Massive amount. And what about the effect of the budget on businesses?
Well, overall, I think it's going to be quite negative because you can't take that amount of money out of the economy. On the other hand, for new enterprises and small firms, they're the engine of growth, and whatever remains of government support, I think, will be directed towards them.
Yes, so there are some incentives there. We had a grouping earlier this week of businesses in Lincoln coming together, and with some big construction groups. Now, one of those big construction groups was saying this year 80% of our business is with the public sector, for example. You take that away, you take away that infrastructure, capital spending, right throughout their supply chain, which is a multi-million-pound business, got very serious consequences. So we shall see what happens. We need to talk, I think, what's the purpose of entrepreneurship, education and learning in the new era? I've got some suggestions around that. What's it all for? How can we create viable business models? None of us can assume the availability of lots and lots of public money. We're going to have to work for what there is and come up with more innovative approaches to creating value, both financial value, educational and other kinds of value. So some questions, we will revisit those at the end and be interested in your thoughts to kind of stimulate a little bit of debate. One of the most important questions, I think, probably the most for me, is this one: how we create the new jobs. And that's been a growing concern of mine for several years now, as the economy has changed. And this week, it looked like there were some figures on graduate unemployment from the last year's graduates, 2009, looking at record levels, not surprisingly, of 20% or so graduate unemployment. No surprise at all. Do we expect that to be any better this year? Quite frankly, no. So there are some very, very serious issues and challenges around creating new jobs for young people, not only graduates, but everyone in the 18 to 25 group, because right across Europe, we're seeing young people's unemployment being round about 20%. That is a huge economic, but a huge social cost, and a huge cost in terms of wasted talent. How the new jobs will be created in small firms, new and also growing firms, the issues of public sector downsizing, and the need to extend working lives. I turned 50 this year, and pensionable age looks further and further and further away. This is the generation that's going to have to keep on working. So there are lots of challenges there, but primarily enterprise and employment have never been more important. Going back, I can remember back to the recession of the early 80s, the early 90s. We're back there with many similar challenges with a vengeance.
David?
Yes.
Yeah, the government is saying that there's going to be public sector shrinkage and private sector growth over the next 5 years.
Yes.
Is there a direct correlation between all that? Because there seem to be real contradictions with a labour force of 20% coming out of universities that could be employed or start businesses, people leaving public sector and then possibly starting businesses. I mean, there just seem to be so many contradictions coming out at the moment there.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, the Treasury, it wasn't the Treasury, it was the Office of Budget Responsibility.
Yeah.
We're talking about 2.5 million jobs being created over the next 5 years. Where from?
Yeah. Where from?
Where from?
They haven't quite said how.
They haven't said how, have they?
Yeah, no. I mean, we would say, well, where is the demand going to come from? Where are the sources of investment going to come from? Particularly with a very difficult banking situation. One can't see large corporate organisations being able to make big investments because the stock exchange has taken a tumble even since the election. So it's very difficult to see where the investment and demand are going to come from to create new jobs. It's not going to be from the public sector, which it isn't. So I think there are some challenges. I'm going to talk about some of these challenges. I don't pretend to have some solutions, but I think some approaches that we can look at from a research and enterprise and public policy point of view. Okay. I'm going to say, I'm not an economist, but I'm going to say a little bit as an introduction about a very personal view of entrepreneurship and Western economies over the last 20 years or so. This is quite controversial. I don't expect everyone to agree with me. You may violently disagree, which is absolutely fine, because we can have a lively debate. But let me just start this off. A little bit of academic speak, but I'm going to suggest that entrepreneurship, and very much the Anglo-American approach to entrepreneurship, has been privileged by Western neoliberal economic management. By neoliberal economic management, you could crudely say Thatcherism, really, about free markets basically being paramount, that the market decides all, and we have the solution is in free markets. Now, that actually worked for nearly 30 years. We had sustained periods of economic growth in the mid to late 80s, 90s, really up to about 2007, 2008. Delivered a lot of economic growth in the developed world, US, UK, Europe. And in public policy, the entrepreneur was very much the action man, and I'm using that term deliberately, the action man of capitalist economic growth theories. There's two writers called Stevenson and Girillo who talked about entrepreneurship being the pursuit of opportunities regardless of the resources controlled. I would put a slight spin on that. I'd say the definition of entrepreneurship became the pursuit of opportunity regardless of the consequences. It really became the pursuit of short-term profitability no matter what else in certain sectors, particularly banking, finance, areas of construction, and a number of others. And that pursuit of opportunity, regardless of the consequences, resulted in a huge creative destruction of economic value in 2007, right really up to the present day. So major negative consequences, unintended consequences of that kind of entrepreneurship. So there's a growing critique of the roles of entrepreneurship, a really liberated, uncontrolled entrepreneurship, in relation to, particularly to European societies. And there are big questions, I think, about the base of academic theory in terms of what is useful entrepreneurship going forward. So that's part of the context. I'm going to talk a little bit about the problems of entrepreneurship in relation to the economy. This probably looks a little bit boring, but I'll go through it fairly quickly. Unregulated entrepreneurial behaviour, I think, was a root cause of the problem. But there should be no surprise about that. If we have capitalism, if we have free markets, we have speculation, we have bubbles, those bubbles will burst. Going right back to Dutch tulip auctions back in the 18th century, and all sorts of things. We get speculation, we get markets ruled by greed and fear. These are inevitable aspects of human behaviour in capitalist market economies, where you get the search for profits and speculation and so on. No surprises there at all. However, over the last 2 years particularly, I've dated back to the Northern Rock crash and then the Lehman's crash and so on, the so-called credit crunch. We're actually still in a credit crunch. If you're a small business trying to raise money, there is still a credit crunch. This is an important point. Many entrepreneurs and business owners, their employees, their suppliers, are being hugely affected, adversely affected by many factors entirely beyond their control. They're entirely blameless, but they're being hugely affected. There's a bit of an imbalance, I think, between the relationship between the freedom given to entrepreneurs in any sector to create wealth and the responsibility of entrepreneurs back to society. We maybe need to rethink that balance, that's, if you like, that social contract a little bit. Now at the moment, we can see there are still very major structural problems in the economy, banking, liquidity, credit and lending, risks, bad debt, and confidence in national economies. You know, it wouldn't be too surprising if a Spanish bank went under next week, for example. It's entirely possible if you look at what's going on in the kind of bond markets in Europe and that kind of thing. And the effects of a banking collapse on the real economy, on business lending to businesses, on the availability of credit would again be very, very significant. It's entirely possible that that can happen. I bank, being a Scotsman, you wouldn't know it by my accent, I guess. I bank with the Royal Bank of Scotland. I found out last week that where I bank is probably going to be taken over by Santander, as you know, the Spanish extend their banking network across the UK. And issues like that sort of consolidation, it actually reduces choice and competition in the banking market. And if you're a borrower, if you're a small business, the risk is that the costs actually go up. So major issues around responsibility of banking, but nothing new there. The thing we know we need entrepreneurship to create new opportunities, new sources of value, economic, social, technological, environmental value, to create the new jobs, to create new business ventures. There is a big issue about can we learn and can we change entrepreneurial behaviour to avoid repeating bad past mistakes, the issue of Pooh Bear coming down the stairs doing bump, bump, bump. There was, particularly under the last government, a lot of discussion about regulation. We need more regulation. Well, do we? I think better regulation is fine, but regulation never solves the problem. It only provides some indicators, some sanctions over what society actually thinks is useful or not useful. To me, I would say this as an academic, but I think learning and education, and within that, the practice of ethical and responsible behaviour and entrepreneurship really are needed. So my view, you may agree or disagree, is that as educators, we have a responsibility to include ethical and socially responsible education as part of the entrepreneurial process. So, I think 2008, 2009, it started a new era for enterprise and entrepreneurship. And when I talk about a new era, that's what I mean. And I've been talking about this for nearly a couple of years or so, but the challenges of this new era that we're in, and the issues and challenges that it pose actually get bigger all the time. That's quite scary. So the credit crunch and the recession changed all of the rules. I think December 2008, we had that very powerful symbolic moment when the chief execs of Ford and General Motors and Chrysler got on their private jets, that was a mistake, wasn't it, and went to Washington to ask for a bailout. Now, okay, GM under sort of a new restructuring, and Ford is still there, Chrysler I think fell by the wayside. But that demonstrated very powerfully that the US corporate 20th century industrial model was broken. So the logical conclusion to that style of Fordist management we see in Detroit, and I'll have more to say about Detroit, but I think there are important resonances between, if you like, the post-industrial belt of the US and the East and particularly West Midlands in the UK. And things we can learn and things we can do differently, but things that are also maybe the same. But very powerfully, the end of the US corporate industrial era came to an end. And let us not forget that that era, that culture, also defined management education and business schools. You know, think of the role of Arthur Sloan, for example. So we in business schools are absolutely tied up with that era and with the big corporation managers thinking that it brought. Now there may be emerging a bit of a cultural divide between the Anglo-American approach to business and enterprise and corporate free markets and the European attitudes, all sorts of fault lines in relation to the EU. What we can see, we've got massive risks in terms of public policy and finance at the moment, and the size of the kind of public debt is only part of that. We need, in my view, new economic and social models which create new forms of value and new forms of employment and enterprise. What those are, I think we're just in the early stages of being able to see new ways of creating value and creating employment, almost beyond the limited company. As universities, researchers, innovators in business, what we need to bring together is the power of the new ideas and technologies which can produce regeneration. By regeneration, I'm talking about economic, cultural, social, and technological. So what we need to be looking at are where are the upside opportunities? You know, if things have been going down for a couple of years, where are the upside opportunities? Yeah, question?
I'm not really sure whether we need new models. I would say one of the reasons of the failure of the current system is precisely a basic capitalist standard was not observed. And the basic capitalist standard is you take risks and you're rewarded. Or else you pay, it fails and you pay the consequences. What has happened in this crisis was said, you fail and we pay the consequences. So it is really, to a certain extent, the abandonment of the basic capitalist system that brought us in there. The other thing is that what brought it on was a concerted, illusionary drive to risk aversion, which again is, in a way, anti-capitalist. So perhaps, rather than looking for something new, we should perhaps revert to old.
Yes, yeah. I certainly, there are forms of older types of organisation that we can go back to and look at and learn from. So yeah, no question with that at all. I'm going to talk a bit about what I call Entrepreneurship 1, the old type of entrepreneurship, because I think we're at a point where we're moving from an old style to a different type, a different nature of entrepreneurship. So we have there the endangered species, the Merrill Lynch bison. We all know what happened to Merrill Lynch. They became extinct. The characteristics of the old entrepreneurship, I think, are some of these. I'm deliberately stereotyping a little bit here. Very much around individual enterprise and self-enrichment through personal effort. Now, nothing wrong with that at all as a motivation, so long as we recognise that.
I think it was David Carnegie who said, a man who dies rich dies disgraced. So the old entrepreneurial style is perhaps not quite as selfish.
Yes.
And the new one, with Bill Gates, for example, seems to be the same. So I'm not sure that the self-enrichment in this sort of stark form, as you said, it really applies.
But I think that's the overriding behaviour that we saw for quite a sustained period of time. So,
but not necessarily from entrepreneurs. Much more from sort of paid hands, be they CEOs or not, but essentially employees.
But even employees operating in what they saw as an entrepreneurial way. So I'm deliberately simplifying.
They wanted the opportunities, but they didn't get the risks.
I mean, the way that markets operate, inherently selfish. We get the greed and fear, the irrational herd instincts. And what we see, what we saw particularly in a number of sectors, is the move to achieve market domination within this paradigm of capitalist economic growth, with continuous growth and scale, turnover and profitability. And you can see BP as being actually a pretty good example of that, of the problems that has brought, not just recently, but over the last few years. We've got this resource consumption model of capture and exploit, which is inherently wasteful, and just use up the resources and then move on, rather than thinking in more ecologically aware ways. So, and a kind of entrepreneurship which is blind to the consequences of its actions on the wider ecology. And I'm taken back to the American election a couple of years ago with Sarah Palin and the choruses of "Drill, baby, drill" in Alaska or wherever it might be. Let's just find the resources, drill them out, use them up, and move on in an entirely irresponsible way. Could even state, and this is controversial, but I would suggest that the old entrepreneurship, in the way that I'm characterising it, is really very masculine in the way that it works. It's very much about aggression, competition, power, domination, control. It's about shafting the opposition. I use the words quite deliberately. this kind of species of entrepreneurship, particularly at the corporate level, tends to be protected by its government, very much the US government in particular. It's inherently destructive of value as well as creative, but the basic problem I have with it is it became centred excessively on the pursuit of short-term profitability above all else. So the question is, can the bison learn to act responsibly, or do we actually need different animals out there, back to Pooh Bear and some of his little friends, I guess. What I'm suggesting, what I'm seeing, is in the businesses and other organisations that I work with, and new entrepreneurs and people who are running businesses and running organisations, I'm seeing a shift, I'm seeing a change from the old entrepreneurship to a new kind of entrepreneurship. Now again, I'm simplifying here. Some of this actually is not new. Some of it is old. Some of it's been going on for a long time. By stereotyping, we simplify. But where the old entrepreneurship was purely individualist, we're seeing much more in the way of individual and team leadership and rather more networked and collectivist approaches to creating organizations, creating and sharing value, for example. Social enterprises and cooperative organizations are examples of that, but so are team-based enterprises. And that's certainly one thing we've seen much more of, is entrepreneurial teams starting and running businesses over the last few years. We're seeing a move, I think, from a blind acceptance that neoliberal capitalism is and free markets are good no matter what else, to a view that there needs to be the exercise of responsibility. So rather than it being the pursuit of opportunity and the pursuit of short-term profitability, regardless of all else, seeing that there's a need actually to be socially connected and inclusive, and that the business, the organisation, plays a part in a wider ecology of society. It draws on social resources of different kinds. It's there and it puts something back. Yeah, it creates economic value and jobs, and it does useful things. So it's about being ethically responsible as well, and moving from being business drivers being very much short-term profitability and growth to a wider responsibility, ethically thinking in terms of resource conservation and reuse. Value creation not simply being about short-term profitability, but wider kinds of value in terms of social value, including jobs and environmental value, creative, aesthetic, technological, multiple forms of value creation. The old entrepreneurship, it really exploits and wastes resources. You know, any good business person running a manufacturing business actually recognizes now they can save a lot more money by operating in environmentally friendly ways. One of the things I'm doing at the moment, we're running a program called Business Inspiration for existing businesses affected by the recession. I spent a day a week down in the Fens in a place called Holbeach, and on Wednesday this week I went to visit a couple of businesses, one of them a foundry. Now it's many, many years since I've actually been around a pattern shop and a foundry, and there used to be many dozens, probably hundreds of them here in the West Midlands. There are still a few, but I wonder how many. Now that guy running the foundry had realised that shoving all of the foundry sand into a skip and getting rid of it, he was spending a lot of money on skips, on waste disposal, and actually throwing away sand that he could do something with. So he invested £100,000 basically in a machine to filter out the bits of metal and everything else, the impurities from the foundry sand. Is dumping about a 5% of the amount of waste he used to be. He's reusing most of his sand, and he's saving a lot of money. Just a small example, but very often we can see that working in environmentally sensitive waste actually makes financial sense increasingly.
Can I just say about that point, though? But he's not driven by environmentally good things. He's driven by making more profit.
Does that matter?
No, it's not benign. It doesn't matter because it's a fantastic behaviour. Yeah. But as long as we all recognise why that behaviour is occurring,
why it's driven,
and why it's driven.
But I think that's That's a primary human motivation, and therefore, and that is okay, it's social responsibility, but in order to get individuals or organizations to behave in that way, they have to see their advantage.
Yes,
and to a certain extent, it is normal because everybody's first responsibility is towards him or herself.
I'm working with a steel profile specialist who's installed rainwater harvesting equipment to save water, and he's also recuperating the slag from the cutting process, in much the same way as you just described. He reckons that the rainwater harvesting saves him no money, but he gets a good deal of social approbation from doing it. So I don't think it's entirely driven by the bottom line. I do think that he likes to go around and talk to business links and conferences about how his rainwater harvesting works. So I think there is a degree of social approbation.
Same sort of experience. I got a company that I worked with several years ago that installed an incinerator. They took back the carcasses of kitchens that they had, because they were a kitchen installer, and then they were using that to actually heat the factory. There was cost savings there obviously, but actually I don't think that was the primary driver. They were in communication with David Bellamy. They were using that as part of the promotion of the company, but also I think the MD had a real driver towards becoming a more eco-friendly company.
Yes, rainwater recycling is interesting. I remember about 10 years ago we set up an organisation called the Hive at Nottingham University, and which was to help new graduate entrepreneurs. And one of the very first people to come through that was a guy called Michael Farnsworth, who set up a business on rainwater recycling and filtration systems and that kind of thing. And I had a very proud moment about a year ago. I was judging the National Business Awards, and we had a presentation here in the West Midlands. And Michael Farnsworth was actually listed as one of the candidates for an award, for a National Business Award in basically environmentally responsible business. So that business idea had come from university incubation to being an award winner within a decade, doing that kind of work. At the end of the day, it's pragmatics, I think. People will respond to pragmatic influences. So a move to be more environmentally sustainable. And I think what we're seeing as well, we're seeing a welcome change, increasing levels of female entrepreneurship and much more diverse patterns of entrepreneurship. And I think the language and culture of what it is to be an entrepreneur actually is changing. So it's moving away from just being the masculine attributes of aggression, power, conflict, let's go and shaft the opposition, to more in the way of feminine values, which tend to be more relational and collaborative and intuitive. Not just going and attacking customers, but maybe also attracting customers. A different style, different approach. And I would suggest we need both. Both are needed. And in terms of finance, this approach, very much fueled by debt, we're seeing much more in the way of grassroots enterprise and resourcing, and if you like, organic financing and growth. Now, I'm simplifying here, but I'm suggesting there's a paradigm shift, a change in the nature of entrepreneurship, which we're seeing. Yes.
David, it seems to me that the new entrepreneurship that you're describing now is much more culturally congruent with European values than it is American values. Do you think this is emerging as a European phenomenon, or could you expect to see the same sort of thing happening in the States?
I think this is complex. I'm going to use an example from the States.
Yeah, this is the problem. This is the problem, because we're sort of halfway.
We are indeed. We are indeed. I was running a session in Dublin actually just a few months ago. We had a really interesting discussion about the Irish economy in relation to this as well. Looking at European entrepreneurship and European enterprise education, one of the issues is very much about context, the social and cultural and political context of Europe, which generally has had a bigger, more active, more interventionist state than the US. I think it's too simplistic to say this is purely US, UK, this is European. That's too simplistic, but I think this style of entrepreneurship is maybe more natural, more comfortable, it fits, it is more congruent in your words with a European take on entrepreneurship. But it's not as simple as that. So go on to
but is this new entrepreneurship really a paradigm shift in reality, or is it just a cultural reaction to the economic cycle that we find ourselves in at the moment? And when the pendulum swings the other way, We'll go back.
And it also depends on the environment in which, where is the entrepreneur is. It's like these paradigms, they vary from place to place. If I give an example of India or like any developing country, like in that the old paradigm is still there. It's like because of the social reforms and the like people didn't care much about the greenery and all these things. They're still focused on the profit.
Now, of course, you're in the expanding economy for now still, anyway.
And it varies in the developed countries. Like a few days before, I've read it. Like in India and in China, for the growth thing, they have like forget that. Oh, I'm sorry. So that was just like that. Depends on the social attribute of the place. That's not all like that. We can't say it like that. Now it's completely changing the paradigms. No, it depends on the way we are.
Yeah, I take that point completely. It is about social, economic, cultural, the context. I think the economic situation has brought this change to the fore, but I think there's a long-term change which has taken place in how we understand and conceptualize entrepreneurship. We're moving away from a really quite simplistic model to a more multifaceted notion of what it is to be entrepreneurial.
My question really was, can the new paradigm, can the new model resist the old model in a global marketplace when the results are short term?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and when the economy then picks up, then we revert back to masculine trade.
Or not even when the economy picks up, when the level of competition picks up.
You have to.
But that's the beginnings of a real debate about this at the minute. Is it right not to take into account China's appalling carbon footprint when you're buying goods from them? I mean, that's a current...
And their working practices, which are draconian, but actually where we were 80 years ago.
It basically comes down to the fact,
do
you want to pay £10 for something or 20?
As the people in Primark who make stuff for Walmart, and then on that.
But even in China, they're recognising the effects, the undesirable side effects of a short-term approach to entrepreneurship in terms of insufficient water, pollution, ill health, and many other aspects like that.
But aren't they going to be driven? I mean, I'm a manufacturer, and I grew up in a small company, and this, had an office next door to shareholders, so I learnt there was a level above a customer. Okay, we did everything you could do with processes and technology, and still weren't getting the return. The last thing we looked at was really developing our people, and that turned out to be the best thing we could do. But we didn't do it altruistically. We did it because we were driven to get a sustainable return on investment. Then when you look at all the best practice, all the exceptional organisations over virtually history, there are some common denominators that they all do. And they're sort of got a nice balance between the old and the new. So really what we're looking at is a situation now where we're being pushed more to the new, because our employees are much better aware of what they should. China's going to go through the same thing. Once their employees are I mean, you only got to look at North Korea, and what was it, somebody telling me that they turned the broadcast off with the Brazil match?
Look at Foxconn for an example of how not to do it.
So I think there's a drive and a momentum there that the other economies, the target economies, are going to have to face sooner or later. It's what we do next that's the key.
And actually, if you look at the best Indian and Brazilian companies, they are doing these things actually,
and always have done for a while.
Yes.
There are Cadbury's that are owned by Kraft now. Started with Cadbury's Village, started with the Quaker output, but actually they're a hugely successful business by just doing good things.
If we want to look at an Indian, let's look at the Tata Corporation, for example. You look at the way that organisation is managed, and look at what it's done for Land Rover and Jaguar, for example. And that group probably has got a much better future under Indian ownership than it had under whoever ran it, Ford or whoever.
There is some element of reinventing the wheel if we're not careful here, because it's baby and bathwater, isn't it? Because old E-ship and new E-ship. I have a personal conflict in class now. About 2 or 3 years ago, I didn't want to teach the old model but I didn't know what the new model was. I know it was emergent, but actually now I see the new model that you put up here. I think, you know, we've got to buy into our students and say that there is a social responsibility, there is an ethical, there is an environment issue to be. It's not just about greed, it's not just about capitalism, because we've seen what that's done to the modern world at the moment.
And I think you're right, it is emergent. I mean, that list of characteristics is, as of this week, it is changing. It will change with entrepreneurial practice. Okay, so moving on, lots of examples, and just a couple. If you wanted to look at young ethical entrepreneurs and rising stars, there's a web link there to an organisation called Striding Out. Detroit is interesting. I referred to kind of Detroit, December 2008, a few moments ago. Detroit is actually providing a very interesting example of a kind of post-industrial renaissance, and there are many examples of green entrepreneurs. If you look at that web link, we'll provide some examples. I don't know if anyone saw a very interesting documentary on BBC back in March called Requiem for Detroit.
Yes.
Yeah. Made by a guy called Julian Temple, filmmaker. And what it showed was, you know, what we've become accustomed to, which is the hollowed out husk of the inner city. The car giants had moved out, they built the beltways, we had the kind of the black inner city, the white suburbs, the complete, almost apartheid between the two. It actually was that bad. And the severe depopulation and impoverishment of the so-called inner city. So Detroit, almost as one of the first Western cities to hit that kind of absolute meltdown. What's happening, not just in the Detroit inner city, but in that area of Michigan, is all sorts of interesting things. So yes, you can see in what used to be the lush suburbs of the inner city, the buildings being pulled down and people actually going back to farming. You know, actually going at a very basic level of subsistence, necessity entrepreneurship, people growing their own farm, food on urban farms. But also young people moving into Detroit and seeing Detroit as actually being a creative space where they can use abandoned spaces and buildings and areas and do new things in areas which are actually quite unregulated. It's not just sort of drug-fueled crime and things like that. Yes, there is that, but there's creative space as well, and people going in to do new things there. So Detroit is kind of aspects of starting again. There are an increasing number of green entrepreneurs doing all sorts of things like recycling and other kinds of environmental entrepreneurship, very much aided by the University of Michigan as well. So there's a strong university presence. So there's interesting things happening in Detroit, and I think there are parallels between parts of the West Midlands and Detroit in terms of not just the downside, but also potential regeneration, innovation, and new kinds of activity which bring about community regeneration and growth. And I think we have to look at how we can do new things in really run-down areas that help to bring that about. Back to reality, the budget, UK public policy and finance. Now, I'm not being political here, but we need to look at, you know, what's likely to happen. One of these figures, by the way, all of these figures might be wrong. One of them I know is, and I'll mention it as we go through it. It's been updated this week. So we have this, the budget last week, government talking about reducing public spending by 83 billion in the next 5 years. This, I think, is very significant. You look at, in the last 10, 12 years, all of the road projects, inner city development, you know, this area of Wolverhampton, going back 10, 15 years ago, wasn't as smart as it is now. I seem to remember. It's been huge investment over recent years. We're going to see a massive reduction in capital spending, so we can look forward to much more congested railways, roads, airports, lack of maintenance, that kind of thing. And the effects on the construction industry as well are going to be really very significant, potentially. There is an issue of can 25% public spending cuts actually be achieved? without there being riots on the streets. You know, we'll see on that one. Even Margaret Thatcher only managed to reduce the rate of growth of public spending, not actually to reduce it in net terms, we might remember. So there's going to be a big impact on private sector contractors. Someone mentioned earlier, I think you mentioned about deflation. So the effects of public sector pay freeze, all of these stealth tax increases that we're getting and are going to get, national insurance and other things, VAT, and very significant welfare cuts. That's going to take a lot of real money out of the economy. It's going to reduce liquidity and demand and that kind of thing. So a very big question is, how far can economic growth and private investment, we're not seeing much of either at the moment, how far can they fill the gap caused by shrinking public sector economy? They're very big questions here, and I think maybe the current government had little choice, but they've taken a very big gamble. I use that word advisedly. I think it is a gamble of how much money can you take out of the public sector economy to see if you can stimulate growth in the private sector.
Can I just say one thing, Dave? You know, and I've worked in DTI in London for 8 years, looking at this sort of stuff. And if only parts of the public sector, right, did what they want businesses to do to succeed effectively, yeah, I would say a lot of that is eminently achievable. Yeah. And so, you know, I hope, you know, I'm an optimist, yeah. So I hope there's an opportunity here.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. To actually be much more efficient and effective in the public sector. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I would go along with that. I think we've had to contend with something called solutions for business, just as an example, and the waste of money involved in kind of branding and all sorts of repackaging business services has been absolutely huge. So yeah, there is absolutely
That's not the problem, is it? The real problem is not the fact that you can make the public sector more effective and efficient and stuff. It's that if you're going to take £83 billion out of the economy, who's going to pick that up?
That's right.
I mean, and actually that's got to come from the private sector, and I can't see why anybody would invest when demand looks flat, and I can't understand why anybody's going to invest because they think they're going to export a lot.
I think there's more than 83 billion of savings in getting the public sector more efficient and effective.
Well, yeah, but you've got all the problem of the multiplier, haven't you, then? You know, if you sack a person and save £20,000.
I'm not on about, yeah, the last thing you do in a decent organisation is sack your people. The first thing you do is look at what your key processes are. And look at how they're more effective.
I'm not arguing about whether or not you can make the public sector efficient. I think you can. What I'm saying is, at the minute, it doesn't look like a very sensible thing to do. To take that amount of money out. You know, okay, yeah. Maybe I'm only parroting Martin Wolf and Paul.
Yeah, no, I think I understand what you mean. Yeah. But I wouldn't want to stop the drive to make public sector more effective.
No, but it's the scale, it's the rate.
That's the issue. Yes. So the question is, and this is, you know, as you mentioned, people like Martin Wolf and Paul Krugman and others, this is a very major debate. No one knows what is right. No one knows what is going to work. So to that extent, I think it is a gamble.
I've got more faith in Martin Wolf than
there you go. So this is.
David, haven't we been here before? Because if we turn the clock back to 1979, when we last had a Conservative government taking office, Margaret Thatcher, she cut everything in sight, including school milk, as we all remember, and we were into recession in the early 80s.
Yes.
And what got us out of that really was a lot of warmongering, and we went to war, and the industry had to sort of be sort of ratcheted back into action. But we were in a recession and in quite a crisis in the early
I remember it well. I actually graduated in 1981, so I was kind of the Margaret Thatcher generation of graduates looking for a job. I remember it very well, and Geoffrey Howe's budget and all the rest of it. What I think got us out of that was North Sea oil, actually, and privatisation. There were some one-off hits of huge oil revenues coming in, and also major privatisations. So those were one-off advantages, which we haven't got now.
Wasn't it also, to a certain extent, a change in attitude to say, don't look at somebody else, do it yourself?
Yes.
And that was something that Margaret Thatcher was harping on about.
Yes,
and she also broke the power of the unions, which at that time were very destructive.
Yeah, I think all of those things happened. They're part of history.
But that was, if you want to use the term, a paradigm shift.
But the problem
And she actually made society much more equal, because before that, Britain, or England in particular, was a very, very socially stratified society.
That was a UK problem. This is not a UK problem. This is a Western economic problem at the very least, if not a global economic problem.
I think that point's absolutely right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we are where we are in terms. This is not a political debate. I have a political stance. This is not about unions and issues like that. This is about enterprise and entrepreneurship, and the role of enterprise and entrepreneurship and education actually in changing and regenerating society. That's the point. So we are where we are with these very complex issues. We don't know the answers. We don't know what is going to work and what isn't going to work, actually. None of us know that. Not even the great economists know that. There are some things we can latch on to. I think we can say entrepreneurs and people that want to make a difference, we're optimists. So wherever we are, there are things that we can do, and indeed we must do. And we've got a responsibility. So taking kind of Schumpeterian, I think I've spelled that one correctly, unlike most of my students, taking a Schumpeterian perspective, that, okay, recessions are cyclical, there will be an upturn of some kind and of some stage. The art of timing is to predict that and actually to act ahead of the upturn. Because if you're investing and building up your business ahead of the upturn, you're nicely poised when things are going well. If you can run your business well in a recession, I started the business that I ran for a number of years back in 1990. If you can succeed and make money in that period, then when the economy improves, you can do vastly better. Some government interventions may actually help. Again, we will know in retrospect what did and what didn't. There are always opportunities. We live in an opportunity-rich culture and society. So lots of opportunities exist or can be created in the slowdown. And we've seen, I'm thinking about the Woolworths that we pass on the high street. Now, is the Woolworths still there boarded up on your high street, or has it been taken over by a Wellworths or by someone else doing something new, appealing to the same market sector, or innovating and doing something new? There are always opportunities to, as badly managed businesses or uncompetitive businesses or businesses that have just run out of time, as Woolworths undoubtedly had, as they're forced out, it creates space to do something new. Now, lots of high streets have got lots and lots of space to do new things in, but that again is a challenge. You can acquire struggling businesses and assets cheaply and innovate and do new things with them. That's the whole nature of Schumpeterian economics and entrepreneurship. We certainly saw, it's less the case at the moment, it may have bottomed out, but property and material and resources, shipping costs all came down very steeply, creating new opportunities for trading, importing, exporting. And certainly it is true over the last couple of years, we've seen the opportunities for more UK manufacturing, new businesses coming back to the UK. Worldwide demand is still relatively restrained, but it is creating new opportunities. And fortunately, most entrepreneurs actually aren't economists, and that means that we're independent agents. We can act creatively, we can act counter-cyclically, we can think, well, I think there's an opportunity to do this, acting on knowledge of the market, intuition, gut feel, creativity, sheer cussedness, no matter what it might be. And so if enough of them are right enough of the time, then we start to get a regeneration.
Which is incidentally what behavioural economists study.
There you are.
That's why I hesitate on raising my hands, because economists are not just one animal.
Now I know what behavioural economics is.
Entrepreneurial economists.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we do know, when people have talked about the late 70s, the early 80s, the early 90s, we know that downturns stimulate creativity, entrepreneurial activity, and startups. So post-recession, you tend to find struggling businesses actually being shaken out as they run out of cash, they run out of managerial capability and they just give up because they can't hang on anymore. Unfortunately, that happens, and I suspect now we've got a new government, we've got our friends or otherwise at HMRC probably being very hawkish about businesses paying their VAT and tax and things like that. We're probably going to see a bit of an increase in business failures. I hope we don't, but there is definitely a risk of that. But equally, we see an increase in business startups as well, constrained by availability of finance. The availability of working capital, investment finance, working capital and cash is a major constraint to not only starting but particularly running and growing businesses. That's one of the biggest problems. But we are seeing an increase in entrepreneurial activity. So being an optimist, here we have Tigger giving Eeyore a good old rogering there. We've got the next generation of innovative and future growth businesses, the hyperactive Tiggers. They're being created right now, and they're really taking good old Eeyore to bits. So that's the question is, what can we do to help them? I'm going to say a little bit about the purpose of enterprise education, which I think is about creating and surviving in the new era economy, creating new era businesses and surviving in the era that we're now in. We've got to challenge the failed economic and social models, including the big government, the big state that felt it had to go in and do everything, lots and lots of very expensive, counterproductive government initiatives. You'll be familiar from your days in the DTI about the limitations of those. Looking at new forms of value creation, how we go beyond the public sector and even going beyond the limited company model. I mean, the limited company model is a very useful one. There are others as well, and we perhaps need to look at what's happening out in the grassroots economy to see how innovative and enterprising people are being. Universities and researchers and businesses, I think, we need to provide the critical and creative thinking to achieve regeneration in intellectual, cultural, but above all economic ways. We've got to give students the confidence to act in uncertainty. And you were talking just now about business investment and other things. There's the absence of confidence. In uncertain times, confidence both personally and confidence by lenders and investors to act bravely and do new things is at a low ebb. And that's one of the most corrosive aspects of the last few years. So we've actually got to recreate confidence, both in students and graduates, but also institutionally, to say we can do new things. We're going to be very tight in terms of resources, but we can actually do new things. We can create new businesses, new organisations, new enterprises, we can innovate. As educators, we've really got to work with and enable the new and existing entrepreneurs and people who are running businesses who don't see themselves as entrepreneurs, which actually is, you scratch a small business owner manager, very rarely do they describe themselves as entrepreneurs. They just happen to be running a business, very often a family business. But helping them, enabling them to learn the enterprise skills they need to survive. And one of the things I enjoy doing most is actually working with groups of people who are running businesses, not necessarily early stages, some of them family businesses, been around a couple of 100 years. And it's I was working a day a week with a group of owner managers down in the Fens. We do the normal things. We look at where's your business now, opportunities for strategic growth, finance, marketing, people, putting it all together into a plan. We talk about, I don't teach finance and I don't teach marketing for a good, if you pay me enough money, I'll tell you why later. But the majority of people running businesses say, well, actually, I'm not too good with the accounts. I'd rather someone else told me where I am financially. They actually haven't got the tools. They haven't got the levers to understand and manage business finance. It's quite worrying, really. No surprises.
Absolutely, that's spot on. In fact, the biggest problem we had as business people in government talking to the ministers was that the ministers had this over-egged perception of business leaders. Yeah. And of course we were saying, well, as a consultant now, I can go into most business leaders and, they're lonely, they've got nobody to talk to. Yeah. Now that's not a sophisticated huge problem, you know. And you know, and I think ministers think they crawl all over the television and they read The Economist every week and all that sort of stuff. So you're absolutely right. They don't have time. You're right. They're human beings.
Absolutely. So it's here we are. We're back to break even. You know, how do you achieve break even in your business? It's like the story of the. I was back down in Merry Hill a few years ago, and there was a scrap dealer in Merry Hill shopping centre, the big metal bashing place. And this particular scrap dealer, his way of working out break even in his business was when the level of crushed cars had got to as high as the fence, and that was break even. Any cars above that, that was his profit margin. So you know, we've got these rules of thumb, and that's how people actually run their businesses. But we've got to be a bit more sophisticated than that. So to survive in the global economy, I think it's about create optimism as well. We've got to collectively create vision and optimism and a sense of can-do that will stimulate collective action and regeneration. It's taking away from the notion that if you start a business, you are entirely on your own. Yes, it's your business, or maybe something you're running with a group of people. There is a support network there. The university, the Chamber of Commerce, the business network is actually there. You are part of that. You can join it. You can participate. You can find out how to not just deal with bad debts, but actually how to prevent bad debts affecting your business in the first place, that kind of thing. We've got to show how to find and create and make the upside opportunities happen. And I think particularly what we have seen and what we're going to see more of is a lot of wasted and latent resources. When we think of unemployment, every unemployed person is a wasted or a latent human resource who is unemployed, they're not doing something. We think of the spaces on the high street, the brownfield sites, all the rest of it. Even large organisations, I'm being a bit controversial here, and I know I'm in a university, but large universities, health trusts, local authorities, even corporations, they tend to have a lot of resources which are underemployed or latent. I used to deal with some work with Rolls-Royce. You know, Rolls-Royce used to patent things for a hobby, so they'd developed loads, literally thousands of patents. They got those patents there. They weren't going to exploit them. It just stopped anyone else being able to do it, for example. So there's huge unexploited IP in organisations like that. We really have to look, it's not just about finance. Finance is a little bit like the language and the measure, but we've got to find new ways of connecting these latent and wasted resources of people, knowledge, finance, physical space, technology together to do new things. And we're incredibly bad at that, actually. And that's one thing that we need to do better. It's easy to blame the banks. It's not just a banking problem. It's more systemic than that. Because by doing that, we can start to identify where are the new jobs and where the sources of value that will enable us to create those new jobs might actually come from. We've got to look at how we make university enterprise sustainable. Now, actually, I don't know how we do that, but it's quite clear that we're going to have to. I did a study last year of the impact of funding reductions on higher education in the East Midlands, not too different from the West Midlands. And when you start to look at what does it mean to take out 25 or 30 or 35% of public funding for universities, it's quite scary, actually. It's quite scary, even accepting that universities are large, relatively inefficient organisations. After all, if you walk around this campus this morning, like mine in Lincoln, it's largely deserted because we don't have any students during the summer. Think on it. University space utilisation, if you get to about 20% utilisation over the course of a year, you're doing well. Now look at that in relation to even a hospital trust, let alone a factory. If you're using a factory or even a hospital 20% of the time, you know, it's not in the real world, is it? Quite frankly.
They're worried if they're not 80% or 90% of capacity, they want to fill the void, don't they?
Yes.
That's where your own brand comes from.
Yeah. So with all of these buildings, absolutely nothing.
Just an example, like Sheffield Hallam University, they're very good in terms of like utilisation during the summer. What they did is they link up with a university college in Malaysia and brought over the students during the summer to sort of like utilise the campus and generate money.
That's great. And we need more of that. We need to be filling universities. So what we're looking at, I would predict, predictions are great because you can always be wrong afterwards, but I suspect over the next few weeks, months, we'll see the demise of Business Link. Even if the brand stays, it might not, it ain't going to have any money, thanks to Mr. Prisk at the new minister. I think the solutions for business, the RDA funding, they will all go.
You want to get on the... This was issued yesterday.
It was. What does it say? What does it tell us?
What this? Well, I don't think I'm a businessman reading this, so I'm only picking up things, but what it's definitely saying is no business link.
Yeah.
And what it's saying is, funnily enough, universities ought to take up the business startup part of that.
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, this is on the web, but this is interesting times.
I was mentoring an entrepreneur yesterday afternoon, so that's why I probably didn't see it. But it's consistent with this.
Oh yeah, I mean, you're not wrong. No, I'm just saying it.
Yeah. What we don't know is what will happen to the higher education innovation funding, which has been pretty useful over the last few years. That may be mainstreamed, it may be cut. Who knows? There has been this announcement over local enterprise partnerships. I think, and it's going back to what you just said actually, I'm talking to our local Chamber of Commerce and saying, let's do something between the Chamber of Commerce and the university to fill that gap. What can we do to make sure local enterprise partnerships are about businesses working with education and local authorities there as well? The danger is they become dominated by local authorities, or we reinvent training and enterprise councils or something like that, which is probably not a great idea. We've got to identify and apply our capabilities as educators to meet a whole range of needs in enterprise learning. And the point you've made about it being international, actually, I think is absolutely right. This is an international economy. So we've got to be able to work with, stimulate and support new ventures, social enterprises and community enterprise, owner managers, and people forming spin-outs from the public sector organisations in all sorts of different ways. These are new kinds of enterprises. We've got to use new learning technologies, and we've got to be commercial. We've got to develop commercial value-creating approaches. So it's not going to be good enough just to teach entrepreneurship. We've got to be practice as what we preach. Absolutely.
Simple.
Yeah.
Can we do it?
Yeah. It's like the plumber with the outside bathroom, really. We've got to move beyond that stage. Okay, but there's a lot more to it than that. We're in a fairly new landscape. But there's optimism. This is just a little example. My eldest son is in University of Manchester, and a couple of years ago I was looking at different forms of enterprise. If you mentioned entrepreneurship in this organisation, I think you'd be shown the door actually. But what they are, they're in South Manchester. They're very successful. They started as a food cooperative, a worker cooperative. And they're the place to go for your organic whole foods and that kind of thing. So these are the kind of things that you can get there. It's all very good stuff, but they're cheaper than Asda. They managed to put the money together to buy out this old small supermarket, which is now where they run their business from. It's a 50-member cooperative business. It's turning over about £3.5 million. It's a sustainable business in all senses of the word. They're now actually starting to do their own farming as well. They've got a very clear set of ethical and social guidelines. So you could say it's not for profit. Well, actually, they do make a profit, but that profit is reinvested back in the business. Now, this organisation is never going to take over the world. It doesn't want to. But my view is there is room for that kind of organisation in every city, probably every town in the UK. You could do something similar. A bit like Subway sandwiches have got a very sound business model which is transferable. Actually, this organisation has got a very sound and transferable business model which you can transfer just by training and educating people to be able to do it. So there's a huge amount of scope for businesses, organisations like that will provide prosperity, they'll provide a service, they'll provide employment.
I mean, this isn't new, is it? The cooperative movement's been going for hundreds of years. I mean, what you're describing though is a transition to see more social type enterprises which don't necessarily have total profit maximisation at the heart of what they're about.
Well, that's right, because I think one of the biggest shortages is going to be about employment. It's going to be about jobs, and particularly entry stage jobs for young people, people trying to get back into the job market. to get started. So kind of almost back to the 1980s from that point of view. I think it's going to be acute in areas like the West Midlands, the East Midlands, and rural areas as well, actually. And if we don't seriously address how we create jobs, then there are going to be major social and economic problems coming from that.
It goes back to one of your earlier slides. It gives confidence back, and it gives the people the ability to have their own inner locus of control and do something for themselves and maybe the local community. My wife has been made redundant twice now. She said the one thing that really bothered her was not the money. That eventually takes care of itself. It's the lack of confidence, the damage to your self-worth. Yes. We've got a lot of damaged people out there that require this type of business to buy into. This is the new entrepreneurship, if you want to think about it. But the only problem with that is it's moved from 3,500 to 3.5 million. If you're not careful, it'll be a self-fulfilling prophecy. It will become another Aston if you're not careful.
Yeah, they don't have the ambition.
They've got to stay with their ethics, and
That's
they've got
right.
to stay with the original concept. Otherwise, you end up with just another Aston or a Tesco.
I think it's about local. They will stay local.
Stay local.
They will always be Manchester.
And that's the way it should be.
Yes, they don't want to come to Wolverhampton, but they'd be delighted.
There should be one in Wolverhampton.
Yeah, that's
I'll start it.
That's the point. Yes.
I'll have that.
I spent yesterday afternoon with a guy I had a lot of time for actually, a guy called John Thorne, and John used to work for Co-op. He started a business called Cool Milk about 10 years ago, and what Cool Milk do, quite simply, is they deliver school milk, but they do that from local dairy herds and that sort of thing. So it's a bit like innocent fruit drinks, but milk rather than fruit drinks. And John is an entrepreneur with a social conscience, and we were talking yesterday, and he said, well, I try to make sure that people come into my business, but they don't stay too long, that they move through the business, and after a few years, they go off and do something else. And actually, that's what we need. So John is kind of a socially attuned entrepreneur, and he's creating a trust fund from his business that will ultimately own the business. I'm tutoring him at the moment. The guy actually has got cancer. You know, he's got a limited lifespan, and what he's trying to do is put his business onto a sustainable footing, so that the future of the business is certain, that it will do good things, but it will provide this kind of route.
There's a bit of a paradox there, though, because if you're getting existing businesses to recognise the talent that they've got, once you start recognising the talent that you've got, you want to keep hold of that talent. Now, the ways you keep hold of it, you know, will benefit that individual talent. But the last, I couldn't put to my shareholders of a really good company, let's recruit loads of people, and they can just use our company as a stepping stone.
Yeah, it's interesting. Increasingly, some businesses are doing that because the age of serfdom largely is over. Even times we can't expect to keep people forever unless they want to stay. If they want to stay, that's another matter. Another business I've come across, and they're a prize-winning one, a business called Go Ape. Go Ape run these sort of, a few people have heard of them. Wonderful event. You can go into a forest and you can do abseiling and high wiring and that sort of thing. It's a seasonal business. Every year, most of their people leave and don't come back, and they replace them with a new set of large students and graduates the next year.
But the point I'm making is that if you had this was a completely business audience, and these were receptive business leaders, they'd be sort of segmented. You'd have some in that area where it wouldn't matter to the business, but you'd have others where if you don't make, you know, you don't actually say that actually, if you've got talent and you want to, you know, and you do things that make them want to stay, that's what you need to do.
And maybe give them a stake in the business, so that actually they've got a feeling of ownership in that business. They don't want to stay.
Well, absolutely.
In fact, that's just happening with this rainwater harvesting company that I was talking about earlier on. They are in the process of forming a new business at the moment, collaboratively with other companies, and they are talking about, they've started to run employee share scheme. And I actually think that is the future. I think there's a greater opportunity, I think, for developing businesses and maintaining employee loyalty that way.
It can work. It can also fail. There's examples.
I think it's difficult to embed in existing businesses and easier when you're starting from scratch.
Yeah, but we're looking at kind of new forms of relationship between the business and the people.
Yeah,
the people
that's how I would put it. Yeah, new forms of relationships are great. Way of putting it.
Yeah. Not every business is going to be sort of a Waitrose or a John Lewis partnership, for example. There's dangers of talking up. They should all be like that. One solution fits all. We know that doesn't work.
It's like you must have a website, but what do you use your website
That's right.
for?
That's right. Is employee share ownership going to work in the post office, for example? I don't know. It's a very complex organisation. My dread, actually, is that if we're not careful, universities can end up being like the post office. You know, a known and loved organisation that hasn't really adapted to fit the future, very entrenched management union relationships, and if not careful, not going to be around too much longer. That's the danger. One of the dangers. Okay, so back to our optimism. I think the enterprises which are going to grow in an economic upturn, or even if we don't have a sharp upturn, but we're still sort of flatlining in a period of economic almost stagnation, not quite growth. The new enterprises are going to be very different from the casualties of the recession, Woolworths and others. They're not all going to be, but they're more likely to be new forms of collective enterprise where the people working in the business have recognised they've got some sort of stake in the future survival and prosperity of that business. They've got stake in it. Environmental sustainability and ethical practices and social responsibility are playing a bigger part in terms of the value system of enterprise and business. It's not a sort of a nirvana by any means, but it's a changing consciousness. We're seeing, fortunately, increasing rates of entrepreneurship by women and by people from a whole range of ethnic minorities, and that again is all to the good. It's not near the levels of participation that we'd like to and need to have, but it's moving in that direction. So that actually is changing the. We can no longer say, well, the stereotype of an entrepreneur is that they are white and they are male, for example. It's changing hugely, and it needs to. So we're seeing a much more diverse nature of entrepreneurship, and that's changing the culture of entrepreneurship as well. It's becoming more diverse and more inclusive. We're seeing more entrepreneurship which is about cultural and creative and technological and knowledge-based. In other words, higher value added in all sorts of different ways. More international as well. And I think that's, to me, entrepreneurship needs to be multinational and international, not just kind of rooted in the local market. Higher levels of creativity and innovation. So the question is, are these people, are they our students? And how can we help them? Because we as educators and researchers, what we need to do, it needs to be relevant, it needs to add value, because otherwise we actually don't have the rationale. So this is a bit theoretical model here. And I guess it's my map of how entrepreneurial education in the new era is changing. So we've got a lot of formative influences leading to kind of changing theories. So all around us we've got global economic change, very volatile markets, cultural change in a sense in which business ethics are changing and people need to take more responsible decisions and critique of levels of public pay and rewards and all that sort of things out there. Very much changing government policy, not only at UK but in Europe and the US. The whole language of government is having to change. Technology changing, all sorts of new possibilities coming in. You know, think of the Apple iPad and the possibilities that actually drives in terms of new businesses and apps and opportunities. And it's quite possible for a group of technology graduates to get together and design a new app and get that on an iPhone or an iPad or something like that, and creating a new business model by doing that. Much more green and environmental thinking, becoming much more pervasive and accepted. Very much we've got constrained resources, and we'll edit that bit out of the film, please. Yeah.
No problem.
Constrained resources, particularly finance and time. We need to be much more aware and sensible about how we use resources. Learners' expectations. Whether the learner is a young undergraduate, someone that's trying to restart their career, someone that's had a family and is looking to start a business, someone's trying to extend their working life, whatever their background, and university, maybe a university like Wolverhampton is actually much closer to that, those different markets and being able to respond. We've got to recognise the personal and the social and the active learning that people need to do, and work with people much more as individual learners rather than as students. So entrepreneurial learning, I think, is about dynamic learning relationships which are active and they're social, and they're connected not just socially, they're connected by use of the technology as well. Changing theories of education and learning. We've got to focus much more on how people apply and use the learning. And one of the things I do, as Ian knows well, I run an enterprise education track at our National Institute of Small Business Enterprise Conference. And my concern is that too much of the enterprise education is knowing about enterprise and maybe seeing things like, you know, Dragon's Den or even, heaven help us, The Apprentice as somehow being representative of the real world about entrepreneurship, and that they're not, they're gross simplifications. I view those simplifications as, it's a bit like the relationship between pornography and sex, quite honestly. That Dragon's Den is as much to do with the real world of enterprise as pornography does with sex. There's no grossly simplified. And it's very dangerous to use things like that as if they're accurate representations of entrepreneurship within an educational process. The point I'm making, we need to teach people to be much more critical about how they look at not just media representations of entrepreneurship, but also entrepreneurial theory and practice and so on. So people students and learners being critical of what they see, I think is very important. To be critical of political stances and of institutions as well. But they need to be able to apply what they learn to their own lives and their own worlds, not just to learn about enterprise for the sake of it, but to think about and understand how they could use that within their own lives and careers. So the purpose may be educational, economic, ideology, but above all, I think, personal. You have to pay attention to what's being learned, but also the experience of how learning actually occurs. That's fairly simplistic, but I think we need to rethink how people learn to be entrepreneurial. Someone mentioned, I think, the SPEED program in the West Midlands. I worked with the SPEED program, which, for those that don't know, it very much came from Wolverhampton, actually Staffordshire, and the West Midlands, and we had 780, I think it was, start-up graduate businesses over a 2 or 3 year period. I had about 20 of those. What I found was, in supporting students starting a business as part of or immediately post their degree program, they needed a different form of learning. It wasn't just, okay, today we're doing business planning, next week is finance, and so on. These people, they were going out there, they were coming up with ideas, turning those ideas into opportunities, finding customers, then trying to work out what to do. And the good news is, from around about half of them are still around and still running businesses a few years later, and they've gone with the waves of the stormy sea of the economy. But there's still some really good SPEED graduates out there running their businesses. And what I found was they didn't just go through that sequence from idea to early trading. They might actually start there with, I found a customer, what do I do now? I have to develop the product or the service that customer wants, so I have to find the resources, so I think I've got an opportunity here, I better do some planning to get back to here. In other words, it's a non-linear process, having to work in all sorts of different ways. The taught curriculum wasn't actually terribly helpful to them. It's about, rather than push learning, they pulled learning as they needed it. So they needed to have people that they could learn from, mentors and peers and entrepreneurs, a whole range of different sources of learning, not just courses, but TV and the internet, and all kinds of different social learning. And there were triggers. There are triggers about, very often they hit a problem or an opportunity, and they had to work out what to do. So they weren't interested in learning about law, for example. Who would want to study business law? but then someone presents you with a contract, or you need to put together some terms of business so that you're actually going to get paid. Well, suddenly you do need to know a bit about business law, but you've only just found that out. So this kind of discontinuous, emergent learning, what I call pool learning, being very important. And these are some of the things that they needed to learn about. Now, my point is, if we're trying to support more students and graduates and people from diverse backgrounds becoming entrepreneurs, we need to recognise that the ways in which they learn are not planned and regimented. They're very personal, they're emergent, they're unplanned, and they need to be supported in a range of different ways. But actually, the onus is on the learner to do the learning, and the university and the educator to provide that support and that set of networks. Okay, now moving on, because I know we're that was the second bit of theory, by the way. Looking at it from a student and graduate perspective, I won't spend too long on this, but I think it's very clear that the graduates of 2010, they're going into a very difficult economy, a very difficult employment market. A couple of years ago, my students were saying, oh, well, we're going to the public sector, we'll be teachers in the public sector, be nice and safe. There is no safe anymore. Even if there was, that was probably a kind of false consciousness. So the new era requires a very enterprising mindset and skills in which their career, if career is a sensible word to use anymore, the career is your personal enterprise. And even for staff, if we work for a university, we are not safe, we are not secure, actually. We need to be role models in terms of being enterprising people that find streams of income and value creation and useful things to do, and demonstrate that you can run your life and career in an enterprising way in very, very uncertain times. And I genuinely mean that. I feel that, and I do that myself. And the people that work with me, I encourage them to take that view as well. So we're working kind of as individual capitalists. I like to think that you're responsible and ethical capitalists in a connected economy. We're seeing the rise of social and new era and different forms of enterprise and entrepreneurship. And I think in 2 or 3 years' time, we'll be looking at very interesting and different kinds of enterprise they're out there in the grassroots now. They're being put together by little groups in Bloxwich and Pelsall and places like that. We're not really in touch with them, I suspect. Very local, very grassroots. But the positive thinking, confidence, was one of the first things I learned about entrepreneurial learning, was that confidence, self-efficacy, the belief that you can actually do something and make a difference. It's absolutely fundamental. And educators, we've got a responsibility as educators to help people develop that confidence and self-efficacy. And the positive thinking to see and investigate and work on opportunities and to be able to act on those. We also know, back to the group of owner managers, people need the economic and the financial literacy actually to be able to make better decisions. I think that's at the core of it actually. People are having the judgment and the tools and the skills to be able to exercise better decisions, because the costs of getting it wrong are that much greater. If you're running a business and you do a few things wrong and you just miss one payment and you get a small county claims court judgment against you or something like that, it's a black mark. It can stop you getting your business loan or something like that. So the costs of getting it wrong are great. We've got intense competition, not just for jobs, but for other things. So actually being different, and I suspect we went through a period in universities of homogenisation, of being expected to turn out. And this phrase has been used a lot, oven-ready graduates. What a horrible phrase, but this is used by careers managers and people that should know better. Universities are expected to turn out oven-ready graduates. Well, who wants to be an oven-ready graduate, for goodness sake? It's about individual talent and enterprise and people being able to make the connections about how their individual and unique skills and talents and identity actually connects with what they want to do and the opportunities. Because we're seeing the declining traditional career opportunities for these oven-ready graduates in the large organisations. So people have got to have the positive thinking, personal enterprise and confidence to develop themselves to either start a business or be employable, and very much the two do go together. So there's lots of new contributions, I think, to enterprise education. We've seen, I've talked about the rise of social and ethical and green enterprise. I think that's important, and it makes a cultural and a real difference, but let's not overstate it too much, actually. It can be, the danger is we talk things up as being more significant than they perhaps really are. And in my drive to Palm Beach every week, I actually pass this multi-million pound development of wind farms, and every week the wind turbines are in the same position as they were last week. They're not rotating. And it strikes me the return on investment from that particular bit of green enterprise is not too great, at least during the summer. Maybe it's windy during the winter. We're going to see, I think, new forms of enterprise and entrepreneurship around public and corporate organisations. And I think it will be to do with these becoming smaller. And it's back to, does anyone remember Small is Beautiful? And Ralph Schumacher, yeah? What goes around comes around. And even good old Alan Gibb, who I've got tremendous regard for, Alan's view of the virtues of smallness and also localism in our organisations. So I think we're going to see more small enterprises being spun out of these big ones. The growth, and there's hugely more to do actually, as we get more and more female graduates and women with aspirations and a sense of what they want to do and actually wanting to control their lives to a great extent. Internationally as well. The growth of female entrepreneurship, multicultural and international entrepreneurship meaning different things in different societies. New technologies and ways of learning, and new methodologies as well to understand it all. So I think there's lots of contributions to be made to entrepreneurship education in the new era to want to reinvent or recreate it. So as educators, we're not all educators in the room, some will decide, but as educators and researchers, I think we've got to respond to a questionable theoretical base. It's moving away from Stevens and Girillo, the pursuit of short-term profitability without regard to the consequences, away from that, recognising there are changing cultural and social values. They're not fixed, they're emergent, they're contested actually as well. So much is actually contested, you know, public sector bad, private sector good, etc., etc. We've got these profoundly changing economic forces. It's a bit like, remember over the summer, the Icelandic ash cloud from the volcano. And we're all sitting on this boiling sea of magma a few kilometres down there. It's a bit like that with the economy, actually. There's this boiling sea of economic forces and banking instability just boil up and explode at any moment. But we do know that universities are going to be profoundly affected by economic change, and we don't know how. What I think we have to do is to be confident and say we are part of the future. We've got a huge role in influencing and affecting and regenerating society and helping people learn to be entrepreneurial and to grasp that and to go with it and actually to shape what's coming rather than just to react and be defensive. And we've got to change learning methods and recognise that students, what students want and need, not always the same thing. It really is changing very, very rapidly as well. So, then we have Pooh Bear stuck in the... That, I guess, it's a bit like it's what we saw for much of the time when the last government was in power, people trying to get their heads into the honey pots to get as much honey out as they could. And there was an old sport, actually, of entrepreneurs trying to mug the government to get as much money as they could. And not just entrepreneurs, but actually people in local authorities and universities as well. I think the days are over of just trying to get as much honey as we possibly can for the sake of it. I was in Sarajevo last autumn, and I was invited there to talk to a group of people in an association of European regions, and I was hugely impressed by what people were doing in Sarajevo, which is still a post-war economy. They can't get into the EU because of the issues around Bosnia, Herzegovina, and so on. What they were doing with massive rates of youth unemployment, very little resources, but acting entrepreneurially in terms of starting enterprise clubs and societies for young people just to get some positive activity going, and doing it with next to no resources, whereas some of us we've had our heads in the honeypots, I suspect, a little bit too long. So I'm going to go back to the questions and really to close with those. We've had a bit of discussion as we've gone along, but we maybe end on that note, and I'm happy to kind of...
Yeah, okay. Well, yeah, I was going to say, yeah, obviously, thank you for that, David. I think if we filled any questions, if people would like to... Young?
Very interesting, and you're contributing from various different areas like learning, entrepreneurship, education, government policy, and all that. I'm interested in government intervention, and as we can see that in the literature, talk about the support for as that's developing winners or picking winners.
Yes.
Do we try to be more selective, or do we need to develop an entrepreneurial environment to create this environment to support small business growth in this kind of environment? So, given the current recession climate, in the future, what kind of support the government can what kind of direction we can go to?
Well, the track record of, again, this is not a political point, the track record of state agencies in picking winners is it's terrible. You know, I actually passed a couple of weeks ago a DeLorean car. And that, yeah, that was
Was it broken down?
Well, it was static outside. Not many of them around. A powerful lesson, I think. That was a government that thought it had picked a winner. Well, they picked a crook, actually, quite literally. State agencies cannot be picked. They do not know. Even venture capitalists, their track record tends to be about 1 in 10. So it is not feasible to be able to pick winners in terms of start-up businesses which are going to grow rapidly. What you have to see is if you have enough people starting businesses, some of them are going to fail, some of them will fail and leave, others will fail in one business and they will try other things. They'll become serial repeat entrepreneurs and they will learn enough to be able to do something, and some of them will work. But at the starting point, you don't know. So my view is, don't try and pick winners. The approach of purely focusing on so-called high-growth businesses alone actually hasn't worked, as far as I know. And West Midlands has probably had a better go at it than most. What you have to do is educate and encourage everyone to recognise they can be enterprising. I use the word enterprising rather than entrepreneur. They can be enterprising in the sense of finding and acting on opportunities. Some of those will start businesses. If we can increase startup rates by people that know a bit more about what they're doing, if we can provide worthwhile support and training through business networks and universities and other means to avoid the obvious causes of failure, we'll have more businesses being set up. Many of them won't grow spectacularly, but there's nothing against more people becoming self-employed and just becoming, if you like, the lifestyle entrepreneur. Yeah. That's absolutely fine. We should recognise that. At least they've got, they've created useful jobs. They're doing useful and interesting things. Even if they're running hobby-based businesses, that's absolutely fine. Happens a lot in the States. And there's always going to be a small subset of people that actually do grow. But if you look at your average technology-based or engineering or manufacturing business, very often it's at least 7 years between starting the business and, if they're going to grow, starting to get enough momentum to start to take off. And very few venture capitalists are going to want to invest in a business that's going to take that 7 years or so. So it's not a simple answer to your question. And again, it's contested territory in that very eminent academics like David Story, for example, attest that entrepreneurs don't learn. Well, if that's the case, what are we all doing here? I'm living testimony. Entrepreneurs do learn, actually, maybe not in the ways that we would like them to, but they do learn. And the ones that succeed certainly learn, and the ones that fail maybe don't. But there's a very limited role for state agencies trying to pick winners, because it doesn't work.
Dave, can I just ask, you've talked about entrepreneurial education, but the picture you've been painting, and you've sort of taken us on a bit of a journey this morning, I think is more than just about business startup, isn't it? And I think as educators within higher education, above and beyond, you know, business management schools, there's actually a role for enterprise as a mindset to really enter into the curriculum, really, inculcating students to help in innovative ways of thinking, of doing things, of behaving, of networking, of, you know, all those.
I completely agree. I would use the phrase, we are all entrepreneurs now, and that whatever people are going to go and do, whether they're working in what are currently public sector organisations, people working in health and education and local government, need to be able to work in enterprising ways to get hold of scarce resources, to actually apply them usefully and sensibly, and to create value, however that value is actually measured. There has been and there is a need to encourage and support and work with startups and get more better quality startup businesses. But there's also a lot of businesses and organisations out there. Take family businesses, for example.
That need people to come out of universities with entrepreneurial abilities.
Absolutely.
I don't really like the word entrepreneurial, but it's a mindset. I mean, we work from the premise we send people out with a mindset.
Yes.
And large industry and SMEs require those employees, not just startups. I mean the attrition rate for startups in the UK is very high. And look at the amount of support we've got in place already. You have a systemic failure in some ways, but we need to be sending out people with that thought process.
That's right. But if we look at things like business closures and business sales disposals, there are a lot of family businesses where actually what they probably need is the injection of talent, or maybe through a knowledge transfer partnership or an internship or something like that initially, but just getting someone in there that can make a difference, that can maybe work with the boss and make a difference to that business.
This is how KTPs work so successfully, is because they can take time out to concentrate on a specific thing that will drive them forward.
That's right.
A marketing or a technology.
That's right. I do think we need to cut the lead time and the bureaucracy involved in starting KT up.
Yes, we do.
Speaking from other people have had that painful experience as well. So we need to make it easier, I think. But yes, that kind of model. Please.
But then to come back to your question, and I wouldn't just call it entrepreneurship education. I think it's more management education.
Yes.
Is it actually? What do you mean by education? Is it training people in entrepreneurial skills, in certain disciplinary knowledge, or is it actually to get them to think more critically? I mean, it was interesting that you had the discussion earlier on about ethics and social responsibility. We have very strong evidence, empirical evidence, that business and management students have lower levels of ethical and moral reason than any other discipline, and we know that their levels of moral reason, they actually decline once they have been through a business school education. So what does that tell about?
It's a damning indictment, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think we need to question ourselves and some of the assumptions and some of the things we teach. I mean, we talked about selfishness earlier on. That's actually empirically contested. All the behavioral psychologists will tell you that people do not act in self-interest. They mostly act in other interest. That may not be necessarily with regards to, some sort of grand notion, but it may be in relation to family, friends, teams. Yeah, that is not self-interest.
It is self-interest. There's a difference between self-respect and self-esteem.
No, it's other interest.
No, it is what my real needs are.
But that is not
I think that's a different.
That is not self-interest as taught by the neoclassical economists.
Yeah,
no, so that's why, and I think we need to have, as educators, and that's why I'm really glad you're putting this up, we need to have more of these critical discussions.
Yeah, we need the debate, absolutely. Your point about training people in entrepreneurial skills, that always can, it's a bit like training Tigger to jump through hoops, actually. Training is not enough. The development of the critical faculties are actually more important than training in the skills. So
activating the innate ability to become one.
Yeah, enabling people to think and as critical thinkers who are maybe sceptical about the things that politicians say, for example, or people in power, that say and criticise the discourses and not to take things for granted is important. So developing those faculties of judgment, because I'm convinced that one of the most important characteristics of effective entrepreneurs is about judgment. And you don't learn judgment by training. You learn judgment
by doing it.
Intuitively, socially, and all sorts of different
well, you learn
ways.
from peers as well, and you learn from experiential, which is a much wider concept.
Yeah. So, and I also agree with you, there's a need for this kind of critical debate, this academic discourse, but not one that's kind of introverted, but one that's very much inclusive, that people from business networks, from cooperatives, from public policy actually can understand. Because one of the things, as academics, we sometimes do, the language that we use excludes people from understanding what it is we're actually talking about. You know, it's the unreadable journals that we try and get into. So one of our responsibilities is actually to open up the debate so that it's one that people can participate in and understand. And I think we're having that this morning, actually. It's a very interesting discussion.
David, can I thank you on behalf of the audience this morning? I mean, we've had a real treat, I think, in the true spirit of what universities are all about. We've got together and we've had these debates, and David's been very thought-provoking in what he said. And I was interested in what you said about in the States and in Detroit. I mean, I was doing some work in the States last summer, and we happened to be on Route 66 in Illinois. And they still have this mentality that, you know, if things fail, you know, go down Route 66, go west, and you know, you'll find a new context, a new environment to work in. And, you know, success will just be around the corner. And another thing that cropped up was, in preparing for today, I looked up one of your old papers in the Journal of Small Business and Enterprise Development. And what was heartening really was that you know, contextual learning, which was one of the main themes it was about, is something that's not new to what David's been talking about this morning. And you know, we can only hope that some of what David's research findings are and his publications are may find their way to influencing some of the policies and that we all live by in the future. But I think we can take a lot of heart from a number of things. I mean, firstly, I opened my dividend statement from the cooperative movement recently, and they're obviously very ethically driven, and they were reporting a 16% increase in the turnover of their business in the last year, which is incredibly heartening to think that people are actually moving resources, they're changing their habits, they're putting their money into institutions that they feel are more secure, perhaps moving away from the crisis in the banking sector. But also in my area of green bioenergy research, I'm also heartened that the Co-op Bank is one institution that is actually taking the deposits and putting them into some of the technologies that David talked about this morning in terms of getting new uses for capital, some of the areas that perhaps the traditional banking institutions are less happy to deal with. So that's one heartening area. The other heartening thing is that is our own students in the University of Wolverhampton. And I've been privileged this last year to work with Barry and John and Ian, and in an entrepreneurial module, and the students actually went forward and raised £13,000 for local charities. But more than that, they found a new confidence, they were buzzing in terms of what they were doing, they were confident. A lot of young people lack confidence these days. It was great to see that coming through in terms of what the students were doing. So thank you very much indeed for coming over from the East, and could people show their appreciation in the usual way? And we hope you'll be able to stay for some lunch. We've got some lunch organised out there, and perhaps have another chance to talk amongst yourselves, do some networking, and also stay with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.